Welcome to the debate. Today we are focusing on, well, one of the most pivotal and perhaps most misunderstood periods in American constitutional history, the era of national prohibition, ushered in by the 18th Amendment back in 1919. Now, this amendment banned the manufacture, sale, or transportation of intoxicating liquors, only to be, entirely repealed just 13 years later by the 21st Amendment.
It really is a remarkable case study, this colossal national experiment in social engineering that, well, ended in a complete constitutional retreat.
Absolutely. And the central question we really have to debate today, it cuts right to the heart of its historical legitimacy. Should the policy of national prohibition be primarily viewed through the lens of its, let's say, honorable, moral, and social reform intentions? That genuine desire to curb widespread societal pathologies? Or is its legitimacy fundamentally discredited by the illiberal nature of its political coalition? And frankly, the catastrophic, crime-inducing unintended consequences that immediately followed its enactment.
Right, and I'll be arguing for that latter position. I mean, the moral and political legitimacy of the amendment is, in my view, irrevocably undermined, both by the narrow and often bigoted coalition that drove it, and by the disastrous structural failure of the policy itself once it, hit the real world.
And I'm going to contend that we must first anchor our analysis in the original social welfare goals of the temperance movement. The failure of prohibition, while dramatic, yes, was fundamentally one of flawed implementation and enforcement, not a refutation of the basic moral imperative to address what was a major social hazard. So my position, it really begins with the undeniable reality of the era before 1920. We are talking about genuine, serious social ills. Prior to Prohibition, drunkenness and chronic alcohol addiction were, demonstrably responsible for what people at the time characterized as countless personal catastrophes and widespread social pathologies.
And those consequences weren't minor, right? They impacted every segment of society.
Exactly. The issues were profound. Soaring rates of accidental deaths, increased community violence, shocking levels of domestic abuse, rampant unemployability, and the systemic poverty that resulted from, men abandoning their wages and often their families to the saloon. Reformers who favored the amendment, they hoped for significant societal benefits. Reducing crime, solving social problems at their root, and even decreasing the heavy tax burden created by poorhouses and an overwhelmed prison system. It's also critical to remember, I think, that this constitutional effort only became financially feasible after the 16th Amendment established the income tax in 1913. That finally removed the largest practical obstacle, the government's reliance on alcohol excise taxes for revenue. So the core moral purpose here, I argue, was sound and aimed at deep-seated public health improvement.
Okay. I respect the focus on those genuine social ills. I mean, no one disputes the sincerity of many individual reformers, but I come at it from a different way. Policy legitimacy just can't be separated from the political forces that secured its passage. The moral standing of the 18th Amendment is undermined precisely because of the, frankly, illiberal coalition that made it happen and the cascade of disaster that immediately followed.
You mentioned earlier an unspoken coalition. Could you elaborate a bit on why that particular political grouping inherently tainted the reformist goals?
Related political movement that included, a disturbing mix: racists, progressives, suffragists, populists, and nativists. Adherents often weaponized the prohibition impulse to advance ideologies that had, frankly, little to do with protecting families from alcohol abuse and everything to do with social control and prejudice.
How did that prejudice manifest specifically in the campaign?
Well, it utilized racism and ethnic hatred quite openly. For instance, the movement leveraged severe ethnic prejudice against newer waves of immigrants, particularly Catholic Italian Americans and Jewish immigrants, whose social drinking habits were condemned as being fundamentally un-American. Even worse, they successfully exploited the wartime fervor against Imperial Germany to condemn German-American beer-drinking culture, using it as a proxy for, American racism and religious intolerance.
That's a compelling argument regarding the explicit illiberalism embedded within the political machinery that secured the amendment. I do agree that xenophobia and racism were, as you say, unashamedly blatant among some segments of the coalition, those who openly sought to make the U.S. less hospitable to perceived undesirable people.
And it was pervasive. I mean, this political campaign really arose from a very narrow, highly sectarian set of Protestant ideals, and figures like Frances Willard actually adopted racist imagery, linking the grog shop explicitly to what she called the Negro center of power. The policy, I'd argue, was ethically tainted from its very foundation.
But, and this is where the distinction is crucial for me, we must separate the bad and dishonorable reasons favored by certain powerful political auxiliaries from the good reasons based on genuine, well-documented public health and welfare concerns. The fact that the movement had an ugly political auxiliary doesn't, in my view, negate the sincerity or the justification of the core temperance goal. If the motivation was public welfare, shouldn't that be our primary focus rather than the secondary motives of political opportunists who just happen to vote the same way?
Well, while that attempt to cleanly separate noble intent from bad actors is conceptually tidy, it's historically very difficult to maintain when those illiberal forces were so central to securing the 2/3 support needed for ratification. However, okay, let's grant for a moment that the intent was good. We must then turn to the most dramatic problem, the structural failure of the policy itself.
A structural failure that opponents of prohibition actually predicted quite accurately.
Precisely. The policy rested on flawed assumptions. First, that Americans would simply stop drinking, which, seems naive in hindsight. And second, that the federal government could effectively enforce a nationwide ban on personal consumption habits. The reality was immediate and widespread defiance, coupled with the inevitable corruption that follows when immense profits are generated outside the legal framework.
Right. Opponents did foresee that a ban would be widely defied and difficult to enforce, leading inevitably to corruption across the entire legal system, from, beat cops all the way up to prosecutors and judges. This failure of selective enforcement undoubtedly brought the law into disrepute. But again, I frame this as a catastrophic failure of state capacity and, frankly, human corruption in the face of immense black market wealth, not an indictment of the fundamental public health goal itself.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that it was merely a failure of execution. The disastrous results were inherent to prohibition policies. This is what's known as the iron law of prohibition, and it pretty much guarantees failure. When banned, substances don't disappear, they simply become more potent, they have greater variability in strength, and they're often adulterated with unknown and frankly dangerous substances.
That shift dramatically changed the nature of alcohol consumption in America, didn't it?
It did, drastically. Before 1920, Americans purchased beer and distilled spirits in roughly equal measures. Now, beer is bulky, it's difficult to transport illegally. Once Prohibition hit, it became exponentially more profitable and frankly easier for bootleggers to ship distilled spirits, hard liquor, rather than bulky beer. So the illicit market supplied stronger, more potent liquor, and homemade moonshine production, often undertaken by amateurs, resulted in products that contained deadly contaminants like methanol.
And the health costs of that shift are truly shocking, providing stark evidence against the public health success promised by reformers. You see deaths from alcohol poisoning essentially quadrupling in just 5 short years, soaring from about 1,064 deaths in 1920 to over 4,154 deaths in 1925.
Right. And statistically, Prohibition failed to deliver the promised public health improvements to offset that spike. If we look at overall mortality and morbidity rates, there's simply no evidence that the cure was effective. But the most significant social consequence wasn't just in health, it was in the complete reordering of the American criminal landscape.
That, I think, is the essential point. While the Iron Law explains the health disaster, the most profound and lasting social consequence was the explosion of organized crime. Criminal organizations existed, of course, but Prohibition, well, it practically created the modern organized crime syndicate in America.
It provided small-time street gangs, usually organized loosely around neighborhoods, with the greatest business opportunity they'd ever seen. The profits were just astronomical, forcing gangsters to become incredibly organized, employing lawyers, accountants, armed thugs, managing vast criminal enterprises.
And the financial scale of this black market really highlights the structural failure of the law to achieve social peace. The money generated by figures like Al Capone, who came to dominate the Chicago outfit, is just staggering. He generated an estimated $100 million in revenue per year from liquor distribution and other rackets in the late 1920s. To give some context, that is easily equivalent to what $1.4 billion in today's dollars. This cash flow funded major syndicates like the infamous New York Five families that really cemented their power during this brief 13-year period.
Exactly. And this rise in organized criminal power completely contradicted the Reverend Billy Sunday's lofty promise that, under Prohibition, the slums will soon be a memory. Hell will forever be for rent. Far from decreasing crime, Prohibition did the exact opposite. The data is absolutely unequivocal on this. The homicide rate increased by a terrifying 78% during the 1920s.
That 78% increase, that number is just difficult to comprehend. It represents a dramatic social decline that the law was explicitly designed to prevent.
Precisely. Sociologists observed that this major crime wave began in the mid-1920s and increased continually until 1933, when, wouldn't you know it, the crime rate mysteriously reversed itself. The mystery, of course, was the repeal of the amendment that year. It demonstrates pretty clearly, I think, that the law itself was the causal agent of social pathology, not the solution to it.
We should also probably briefly touch on the constitutional ramifications. The 18th Amendment demonstrated that national constitutional power could be mobilized for large-scale moral and public health engineering. It applied not only to interstate commerce, but also intrastate and foreign transactions, a sweeping scope, as the Supreme Court confirmed. This was a powerful commitment to establishing a national standard of morality, binding on everyone, all levels of government.
That's an interesting point about the mobilization of national power, though I would frame it differently. The political controversy stemmed directly from the federal government suddenly policing activities that implicated individual social habits and morality. That was a role traditionally reserved, for state and local governments. This unprecedented nationalization of moral policing felt like an illegitimate overreach to many, many Americans.
And that nationalization created immense public defiance, which then further eroded respect for the authority of law generally.
Exactly. Its eventual repeal by the 21st Amendment, and it's the only time a constitutional amendment has ever been repealed in its entirety, indicates that the American public ultimately judged this particular use of constitutional power to be an overreach that caused far more harm than it solved. You had organizations like the Women's Organization for National Prohibition Reform, often led by women who had once supported the cause, becoming powerful advocates for repeal. They recognized the policy was structurally destructive, impossible to enforce, and they also argued for the need for tax revenue during the desperate times of the Great Depression.
So in summary, my view remains that the 18th Amendment was a profound expression of a genuine, honorable desire by many reformers to protect society, families, and individuals from the very real documented harms of widespread alcohol abuse. Their moral goal was clear, and it was made financially plausible by the new income tax structure. Its ultimate devastating failure stemmed primarily from unexpected criminal innovation and the structural difficulty of enforcing such comprehensive legislation against determined popular defiance.
And conversely, I'd argue the enduring legacy of the 18th Amendment is primarily a caution, a major one, against allowing narrow, illiberal political coalitions and specific sectarian aims to constitutionalize highly restrictive social policies. The immediate, overwhelming, and thoroughly documented unintended consequences, the rise of organized crime, the increased danger from unregulated products, the staggering jump in the national crime rate, demonstrate unequivocally, I believe, that the medicine of prohibition was tragically worse than the disease of alcohol abuse.
Well, the history of the 18th Amendment certainly forces us to confront complex questions about the appropriate role of national law in regulating personal morality, and the immense challenge of accurately calculating both the intended benefits and the unseen, often corrosive costs of major social policy decisions.
Absolutely.
There is clearly much more to explore within this pivotal and, yes, cautionary moment in American constitutional history. It confirms, I think, that good intentions are simply not enough when the policy mechanism itself is fundamentally flawed.